I will never forget the moment my grandfather's voice sliced through the artificial warmth of that Christmas dinner. The chandelier cast a soft golden glow over the long table. My parents were laughing louder than necessary, desperately staging the image of a perfect family. Guests raised their glasses, the fireplace crackled, and everything looked like a winter painting polished to the point of lifelessness. Then he gently set his fork down, turned his head directly toward me, and asked a question that froze the entire room. "Ava, are you still living in the house I bought for you?" I went still. My heart skipped a beat. What house? I had never had any house at all. I whispered, barely hearing my own voice. "Grandpa, I'm not living in any house. I never received anything." My mother's wineglass slipped from her fingers. My father's smile cracked apart like cheap paint. The air in the room thickened, heavy like snow pressing against a roof. My grandfather, the man who had vanished for 10 years, turned toward them. His gaze was as cold as the Vermont wind cutting into bare skin. Between the flickering candles and the magnificent Christmas tree, I suddenly understood something in this family had just fractured, and it would never go back to what it once was. Before I tell you what happened after that moment, tell me where you're watching this video from. And if you've ever sat through a family dinner that looked warm from the outside but was filled with secrets underneath, please like and share your story in the comments. Now then, let's return to that Christmas dinner table. The place where a single question was enough to expose the truths my family had hidden for so many years. No one in that room knew that the real storm was only just beginning. The last clink of glasses faded, and the entire table fell into a thick, suffocating silence. Outside the window, Vermont snow settled on the roof tiles like a layer of silver powder. Inside Whitlock Winter Manor, the candlelight that once seemed warm suddenly felt strangely cold. Vivian clutched her napkin so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Charles glanced around as if searching for an invisible escape route. The guests who had been chatting cheerfully only minutes earlier now sat perfectly still, their eyes darting between Ava and Henry as though watching a slow-motion explosion. Ava stood there, exposed, as if dragged under a harsh spotlight. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing against the wooden ceiling. The scent of cinnamon waffles and red wine still lingered in the air, but everything felt tight, constricted. Henry leaned slightly forward, his gaze cutting through the tension like a taut string. "Explain," he said. His voice didn't need to be loud. A few guests instinctively straightened their posture. Charles opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Vivian bit her lower lip so hard her lipstick smudged. Ava's fingers tightened against the hem of her dress, her palms cold. She heard the faint crack from the fireplace, a sound that marked the moment every layer of pretense began to crumble. No one spoke. No one dared move. The room looked like a perfect Christmas photograph, freshly torn from its frame. That silence lasted for exactly one breath. Henry planted both hands on the table, his silver ring reflecting candlelight like a thin blade. "Where does Ava live?" he asked. Why was I told she had received a house? What house? Charles attempted a smile. Something warped, stiff, like a candle about to snap. "Dad, it's not what you think. We were just waiting for the market to stabilize, so—" "Stabilize," Henry cut in. "For 3 years you've fed me how many excuses," Vivian burst out, her voice trembling like dry leaves outside the porch. "Dad, we just wanted to pick the best time to buy. To avoid waste. Real estate investment isn't simple." A guest coughed softly, pulling her shawl closer, as if just waiting for the doors to open so she could escape this slow detonation. Ava drew a deep breath. "Grandpa," she said, her voice fading. "I live in a studio on Pine Street. The ceiling leaks. The heater's broken. I..." have never had any house. Henry straightened up, his shadow stretching long across the red carpet. Everyone to the great room, he said, slow but firm. I want an explanation, where no one can hide behind candlelight. Tomorrow, at 9 o'clock in the morning, one more person would join them. A person, as Henry said, not easily fooled by liars. That night, when Ava opened the door to her studio, she had no idea she was about to brush against a truth that had been buried for 3 years. The small studio had only one yellow ceiling bulb, swaying slightly in the wind. Ava closed the door, her back resting against the old wooden surface, hearing the faint groan of the worn hinge. Cold air seeped through every layer of her clothing, crawling straight to her spine. The room was too quiet, so quiet that Ava could hear the beat of her own heart heavy, uneven, as if trying to remind her of something she had spent her whole life avoiding. She set her phone on the table, removed her gloves, and exhaled long breaths of white mist. The smell of old wood and dampness from the leaking ceiling filled the space. An empty cookie box lay on the broken electric stove. The wall behind her bed had a crack, one Ava used to joke was her own scar. But tonight, that crack looked too much like her past. She sat at the edge of the bed, her hand brushing against her old sketchbook. The first page held the architectural drawing she made when she was 19, the lines still immature, but filled with hope. Ava flipped a few pages, then stopped. Each pencil stroke appeared like veins of guilt she thought she had carried for years. If I had tried harder, maybe I wouldn't be living like this. If I were better, maybe my parents would believe in me. But tonight, as the yellow light outlined a life she had tried so hard to maintain, Ava began asking the question she had avoided for so long. What if it wasn't my fault? The Vermont wind whistled through the doorframe, answering her for her. There are moments when the past doesn't just return. It demands to be faced. Ava remembered that morning clearly. She wore a dark blue coat, standing outside the Burlington School of Architecture campus, holding the acceptance letter she believed would change her life. The air was still misty, but inside Ava was a blazing summer. She ran home, practically flew up the steps. "Did Mom, I got in." Charles looked up from his newspaper only long enough to give a quick glance. "That major won't feed you. Our family doesn't have money to waste on something so frivolous." Ava froze, still holding the letter like a child proudly showing a drawing. Vivian stepped forward, the scent of her perfume drifting past the kind of scent Ava always associated with people who were never wrong. "I know you like to draw, but life is more practical than that. Choose something stable. Don't make us worry." The smile on Ava's lips dimmed slowly, like a light bulb losing voltage. She thought she wasn't good enough. She thought they did this because they cared. Ava had no idea that during that same week, Henry had sent a full year's tuition including dorm fees and materials for her. The opportunity had arrived. But the adults in the house stood at the door and locked it. Ava couldn't step through not because she lacked ability, but because the door was never opened. There are pains that don't just exhaust you. They get labeled as lessons. Ava remembered her 20s years others called youth, but for her, were just survive one more day. In the mornings, she stood behind the coffee counter, her hands burning from steam. At night, she entered data in a tiny office until the sound of typing echoed through the room. There were days when snow piled up so thick the bus stopped running, and Ava walked home in soaked clothes. As soon as she pushed open the door, she saw Vivian checking bills. "Mom, I need to borrow some money to pay for my graphic design class." Vivian didn't look up. "No, Ava, adults must stand on their own." Ava stayed silent. She never mentioned the heater that had been broken for 2 weeks, the 3 days she skipped breakfast, or the time she nearly fainted at the bus stop. And she especially never mentioned that the graphic design class was the only thing that made her feel like herself. What she did not know was this. Henry had sent additional money, with a clear note, for the girl to live like a young person. But Ava remained trapped in days meant only for survival. Because the lifeline meant for her had never reached her. The present. Ava leaned against the window, watching snow blanket the rooftops. A cold truth cut into her heart. She wasn't lacking effort. She was lacking what had been taken away from her. At Whitlock Manor, Henry stood before the fireplace, his fingers gripping his phone until they turned white. On the screen was the photo of the house bought for Ava, the one Charles and Vivian sent 3 years ago. He zoomed in. The façade looked exactly like a promotional listing, perfect to the point of fake. Henry set the phone down on the wooden table. The soft tap was quiet. But inside him, something collapsed. 3 years of blind trust. The firelight flickered across his face, no longer that of a father waiting for an explanation, but of a man who had decided the lying must end. And tomorrow morning, Henry wouldn't be going to listen. He would be going to expose the people who had stolen his granddaughter's future. That morning, Ava didn't wake because of the light. She woke because of a feeling she had never quite known before, the sense that she was about to face herself. The dim morning light slipped through the thin curtain, falling across the studio wall still marked by stains from leaks not yet dry. Ava opened her eyes. The heaviness on her eyelids made the scene before her blur slightly. The thin blanket slid off her shoulder, revealing skin still cold from the night before. The space was strangely quiet. No more howling wind like last night, only a gentle cold seeping into every breath. Ava pushed herself up, feeling a line of pain run down her spine, the familiar ache from years of sleeping on the bed she jokingly called the chair bed/breakdown zone. She stepped barefoot onto the floor, touching wooden planks as cold as stone. The kitchen still held an unwashed bowl. An old teapot sat empty. A few unfinished sketches lay stacked together, full of strokes drawn by someone who had tried too hard and received too little. Ava stood before the small mirror hanging on the wall. What stared back was a face she knew, yet hurtfully unfamiliar. Dark circles, pale skin, eyes that belonged to someone who had trimmed down her dreams to fit into a life she could barely afford. She placed her hand on the cold glass. Inside her head, countless phrases she had heard for years echoed again. You're not practical enough. You have to stand on your own. You should know your place. But this time, in the little room, with her breath mixing into the still air, Ava heard a different voice, her own. She looked deeper into her reflection. For the first time, she didn't see a problem child, didn't see a burden, didn't see someone unworthy. She saw someone who survived nights under a leaking roof, survived long walks home because she didn't have the money, survived years of blaming herself for thinking I'm not good enough. A long breath escaped her, but this one was lighter than any before, as if the morning had finally swept away the dust that had weighed on her chest for so long. Ava whispered a sentence she had never dared to say out loud, yet it was the key that would walk with her through the rest of her story. I used to think I wasn't enough. But maybe they just never gave me what I was meant to have. A tear fell, but it wasn't bitter. It felt like release, like someone finally understanding she had never been wrong. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with a different gaze, less fear, and something resembling a spark of strength. A soft knock echoed through the room. Ava flinched. She walked to the door and opened it. Henry stood there in a thick coat, his breath turning into mist in the cold air. Not angry, not impatient, just the steady resolve of someone who had chosen to protect what was right. Let's go. Ava. Ava nodded. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was walking behind someone. She felt like she was walking with someone. That morning, the road from the studio to the law building wasn't long, but it was quiet enough that Ava could hear every beat of her own heart. The Vermont cold swept in the moment Ava stepped out of her studio. Henry was already standing beside the black SUV, holding the door open for her, a gesture so old-fashioned it felt like something he should have done her whole life, but never had. Ava froze for a second, such a small act, yet it struck a place deep inside her, a place that had always wondered, why has no one ever opened a door for me? She sat in the passenger seat, the seatbelt clicking shut. The car moved forward. The warm scent of pine wood blended with the sound of tires rolling over a thin sheet of snow. For a while, no one spoke. But the silence between them wasn't like the past years avoiding. Cold, distant. Today, it felt like preparation. Henry glanced at Ava through the rearview mirror. Ava. His voice was rough. I read through everything again last night. Ava turned her face toward the window. Snow-covered branches stretched out like rows of memories she had never been allowed to touch. I didn't want to burden you, she whispered. Henry tightened his grip on the steering wheel. I should have been worried a long time ago. Silence returned. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. Ava felt it press lightly on her chest, then dissolve, like the last breath of an old sadness. When the SUV turned into downtown Brattleboro, the law building appeared through a thin layer of mist. Its tall glass facade reflected the pale gray sky. Ava tugged on her sleeve, her heartbeat quickening. There was no turning back now. The moment the glass revolving door opened, Ava saw her parents looking like two people who had just escaped a nightmare. Inside the building, the atmosphere was nothing like the outside. Cold, clean, sharp as metal. Ava inhaled deeply, her breath forming a thin mist in the unnaturally still air. The waiting room was furnished with black leather chairs, glass tables, and a glowing wall clock, its ticking second hand loud enough to raise goosebumps. Charles and Vivian sat farther away, where the white overhead lights made them appear even more worn down. Charles was biting his lip until it bled. Vivian kept tugging at her sleeve, her hands trembling slightly. They saw Ava. Both immediately looked away, but not fast enough to hide the fear on their faces, fear exposed under harsh light. Ava's instinct was to lower her head. Years in that household had trained her well, but Henry placed a steady hand on her shoulder. No one gets to make you small anymore, he said quietly. She inhaled, not a deep breath, but enough to stand a little straighter. A staff member walked over blue shirt, holding a thick cream-colored envelope. Mr. Whitlock, here are the documents you requested. Henry took it. His expression shifted sharper, heavier, like a man who had finally seen the thing he had suspected all along. Ava stared at the envelope, unease crawling down her spine. What's in there? You'll know soon, Henry replied. The clock read 8:57. Each second felt like it pressed directly onto Ava's chest. Ava sat on the row of chairs nearest the meeting room door. Her back was straight, but her hands were tightly intertwined. The tick, tick, tick of the clock echoed steadily, counting down the final seconds before her life would change direction. Henry stood in front, looking through the frosted glass of the meeting room as if he could read everything happening inside. He said nothing more. He simply stood there steady like the pillar Ava had never had. Ava unclasped her hands. She looked down at her palms, red, damp, slightly cold, but no longer trembling like last night. She whispered to herself, I'm not the one on trial. I'm the one reclaiming the truth. A long silence followed, as if the world held its breath for one more moment. and all the lies would collapse on their own. Then the receptionist stepped over, placing her hand on the glass door. "Mr. Whitlock, it's time." The door opened, and bright white light spilled out as if ready to strip everything bare. Ava stepped into the meeting room and understood instantly. Today was not a family discussion. Today was a trial. The room was flooded with white light reflecting off the long table, making every expression sharper than anyone would ever want to reveal. Ava walked beside Henry, each step heavy, as if the wooden floor were recording their footprints as evidence. Cold air from the vents mixed with the smell of new paper and the metallic scent of binder clips. It felt less like a conference room and more like a closed-door hearing. Charles and Vivian sat on the opposite side. No words, no eye contact. But their shoulders were drawn inward, like two people waiting for the verdict they knew was coming. At the head of the table sat Reed Harper. His gray suit held not a single wrinkle, yet his gaze was sharp enough to crack the surface of the table. "Let's begin," he said, not loud, but enough to silence the room completely. Reed opened the thick file in front of him. The first page flipped with a single swipe of his hand, yet the sound cut through the silence like a blade. 2 years of unusual withdrawals, Reed said. 12 undocumented expenses. And this? He slid a sheet toward Ava. She pulled it closer. Her heart jolted. A beautiful signature. Smooth. Written in her full name but not in her handwriting. "We have reason to believe this signature was forged," Reed continued. "It was used to authorize a major withdrawal." Ava stared at the perfectly curved ink strokes, and something inside her, something long suppressed, flickered back to life. Henry placed a hand on the table. His voice was low, steady, carrying years of disappointment. "Go on. Read. Today. We say everything." No one breathed deeply. No one moved. The air in the room shifted into the color of truth. The moment Reed opened the cream-colored envelope, the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Ava knew the worst was still waiting to be spoken. Reed set the envelope on the table, his hands so steady the silence grew heavier around them. Henry leaned slightly forward, his gaze sharpening. Ava sat still, hearing only her heartbeat echoing in time with the ticking wall clock. Reed lifted the first sheet. $18,400 transferred to Mr. Charles's secondary account. He read, voice devoid of emotion. Second sheet. Jewelry purchase $6,200. Third, Aspen vacation. 2 guests. $9,800. Fourth, lake house renovation, $103,500. With each line. Charles's face paled further, while Vivian twisted a tissue so hard it tore in her hands. But the real blow had not arrived yet. Reed opened the fifth item, a digital audio file printed and logged from Vivian's cloud backup. "I believe Miss Ava needs to hear this." He pressed play. A faint static crackled, then Vivian's voice clearer, sharper, colder than Ava had ever imagined. "She has to fend for herself. We can't keep rescuing her. Using that money is reasonable. It's not like she needs to live comfortably." Ava felt her body freeze from her neck down to her wrists, not because of the words themselves, but because of the utter lack of feeling in them, as if she were an object to be allocated, not a human being. Charles shot up from his seat. No, Vivian didn't mean that. She was under pressure. I only did what." Reed placed another stack of papers on the table. "This is the signature you used for the withdrawals." Ava studied the curved, polished, rounded ink. Not her handwriting. Never had been. Vivian burst into tears. "We just wanted her to learn responsibility." "We thought no," Henry interrupted. His voice struck like shattering stone. "You thought she wasn't worth it." The air thickened until Ava struggled to breathe, not because of the numbers, but because she was looking at the two people who gave her life. and she couldn't recognize either of them. Ava rose to her feet. No chair scraping, no sudden movement, just a slow, steady ascent, like she was finally stepping out of the shadow they had built around her for years. She looked straight at Charles and Vivian. "What would I have to be?" Ava asked, her voice so soft it silenced the entire room. "To ever be enough for you," Vivian cried harder, but her tears seemed rooted more in fear than remorse. Charles clenched his hands until his knuckles turned white. Neither answered. Maybe because, for all those years, they had never once considered the question. Ava inhaled slowly. In that instant, she realized the deepest wound wasn't the money stolen from her. It was that they had never believed she deserved a better life. Henry leaned forward, his voice landing on the table like a verdict long prepared. "From this moment on, neither of you has any decision-making authority over Ava. The transfer documents will be signed. If you refuse, I will proceed legally." Charles lurched to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. "You have no right, I do," Henry replied, "because I'm the only person here who still understands what responsibility means." Ava did not step back. She looked at her father as if he were a stranger, and in that gaze, the last thread tying her to him finally snapped. Reed placed one final document on the table. His voice lowered, directed straight at Ava, "Miss Ava. This is something they never wanted you to know." The news from the meeting room hadn't even cooled before it spread beyond Reed Harper's office faster than anyone inside could have imagined. The Vermont afternoon fell like a thin curtain, yet Ava's phone lit up again and again like out-of-season fireworks. Message upon message from relatives, from people in town, from acquaintances Ava thought would never reach out to her. A cousin wrote Ava, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know something that awful happened to you. An old high school friend, I always thought you were strong. I didn't know you went through so much." Ava stared at the screen, her hand trembling slightly. Not because of the support, but because, for years, no one had ever placed her at the center of any story. Meanwhile, Reed sent an email update. "Some documents must be moved to a financial consultant. This is no longer a family matter." Ava read that line multiple times. No longer a family matter. For the first time, the truth stood on her side without asking anyone's permission. Henry watched her from across the table. "You don't have to respond to everything," he said. "Just know, today is the day they finally see you." Ava nodded. A small nod but deep, like dropping a stone into a frozen lake and watching the ripples spread beneath the ice. Across town, the atmosphere was completely different, and Charles Whitlock felt it more sharply than anyone. Charles stepped into the local company building, his face stiff as stone, but the secretary greeted him with an expression unlike any other day. She stood up, slightly bowed her head. "Mr. Whitlock, the board wants to see you privately." 10 minutes later, Charles was told to temporarily suspend all activities until the investigation concludes. The sentence landed like a blade striking the pride he had always worn on his shoulders. And Vivian. At the grocery store, people who once complimented her expensive coats now whispered as she walked by. Some close friends turned away. The woman at the checkout didn't even look her in the eye. Vivian's voice trembled as she told her husband once she got home, They looked at me like I was a monster." Charles shouted, "We will get through this." But even he didn't believe his own words. Ava heard about all of it from Henry. She didn't laugh, didn't feel triumphant, didn't seek revenge. She simply felt a part of the weight lift from her shoulders. When Ava returned to her Pine Street studio, her phone buzzed again. Dozens of new messages from people who had once dismissed her. Some expressed shock, some apologized, some said they should have protected her long ago. Ava set her phone down and inhaled slowly. For the first time, she didn't feel like the shadow behind Charles and Vivian. She existed, clearly, fully. Henry looked at her, his voice soft but firm. Tomorrow, we learn the rest of the truth. Just then, Ava's phone rang. The name on the screen, Reed Harper. Ava picked up. Reed's voice dropped low. Ava, the final document. The results are in. There are truths that do not make the heart heavier, but instead lift a weight you've grown so used to carrying that you no longer realized it was there. That Vermont afternoon settled into shades of silver gray, and Ava sat across from Reed in a small cafe in Burlington, a place where no one cared who she was or what had been done to her. Reed placed the file on the table. He didn't speak immediately. Ava, he began slowly. The results are in. Ava opened the documents, her eyes moving over cold, emotionless lines. Charles and Vivian had used her name to apply for preferential credit limits. Part of that loan had been funneled into their personal transactions. But Ava did not legally bear responsibility for any of it. Reed pointed to the final line. Henry has been working for weeks. He made the bank revise the entire record so nothing would fall on you. Ava froze. Not because of the numbers, but because, for years, she had lived as if she owed everyone something. Reed looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. Ava, you were never a burden, he said, softly enough to tighten her chest. They just made you believe that, so you couldn't see your own strength. A long breath escaped Ava, not from exhaustion, but from a kind of release. She didn't have to brace herself anymore. She didn't have to keep blaming herself. The truth, finally, stood with her. When Ava returned to her Pine Street studio, the sunset cast gold across the old window panes. A thin layer of snow clung to the sill, reflecting the warm light inside the small room. She set her coat on the chair and stood there for a moment, simply feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time, quiet that didn't frighten her. Ava opened the window. Cold wind swept in, brushing her face. But this time, she didn't shiver. She stood steady, as if her own body finally understood it was time to breathe like someone free. Henry stopped by a few minutes later, holding a still warm pastry. He set it on the table, looking at her with the kind of gaze he saved only for real family. Ava, he said softly, you've lived exactly as I always believed you could. The words made Ava's throat tighten, not from pain but because, for the first time, she was being acknowledged for her true worth. She sat at her desk, rolling a pencil between her fingers. The sketchbook lay open in front of her. Ava drew in a slow breath, ready to write the first chapter of a life she would choose on her own. 9. There are mornings when the light falls in a strange, gentle way, as if reminding us that life truly can begin again. Ava stood by the window of her Pine Street studio, where the first rays of sunlight slipped through the frosted glass and brushed softly against her face. She looked at her reflection on the pane, not the reflection of someone fragile, but of someone who had finally stepped out of the place that once made her small. Her heart felt light. No more heaviness. No more asking, why did they do that? No more believing she somehow deserved what happened. Ava understood something she had never dared to think before. Not everyone who carries the Whitlock name is family. Family is sometimes the people who see you even when you disappear inside your own household. She smiled gently, as if speaking to the smaller version of herself from years ago. If you've ever been underestimated, ever been made to believe your worth was small, I hope you remember this. You are not invisible. You're just standing in the wrong place. A warm, steady breath filled Ava's chest. Real, grounding, alive. She placed her sketchbook on the table and opened to a blank page. The Vermont wind slipped through the doorframe. carrying the first chill of the season, but it no longer made her shrink the way it once did. Ava put on her coat and closed the studio door behind her. No dramatic music, no theatrical moment, just a woman stepping into the chapter she would write for herself without asking for permission, without fear. If, in this story, you saw a piece of yourself, if you have ever been overlooked, pushed aside, or made to shrink, stay here with me. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can share more meaningful and inspiring stories with you. See you in the next story.